Hi Milla, this is Professor Evans with feedback on your SA2, the rhetorical analysis. So when we start thinking about feedback, we start thinking about what were the criteria that we were looking for in this essay. And the first one, again, as always, is this idea of an effective introduction. It introduces the topic and kind of engages the reader, puts a reader into a context. A clear thesis that kind of states out what you're going to argue in your paper about whether it is or is not effective. Think of it as a guidepost or a road sign. This is where I'm going to go in the paper for the reader. An effective structure, kind of how you're organizing the paper as you're moving through these elements. Specific examples to support convictions or assertions that you're making about the text. A fairly limited rhetoric, a number of rhetoric elements that you're looking at, so you're not trying to do lots, but kind of fairly narrow range, but in depth. And not getting trapped into the meaning of the essay and the purpose of the writer, but rather your purpose, which is rhetorical analysis. So one of the things, and I think that final point may be the place that we want to start. I think you are. I got this idea that you're definitely thinking about how Harris is trying to persuade the audience. But I think it's getting a little overwhelmed by the argument about whether or not torture should be used or not. So look specifically. Right, so this part when you're starting to talk about collateral damage, to find the paper, it's crippling or injuring those who are not directly involved in conflict. So the body of the article appears to be, appeals to our emotions. He asks us to consider a world where peace was instinct, but what would happen if we laid down our arms and refused to fight? The thugs would inherit the earth, and you kind of drop that down in there. I think I would have tethered it or tied it with maybe a signal phrase into the text as well. So then you're kind of going through this. That is to say, if torture is bad, the concept of drop is bad, then finding men is bad too. So you're kind of playing with the ideas here, but I think you need to use the language that we kind of talked about. So you're saying that he's logically building this argument right here, that he's doing this step by step. I've said this to a couple of people during the course of my feedback, is that a lot of times logos or logic needs to be looked at as kind of a global scale. What is he doing over the entire course of the article as opposed to a specific section? And I think that's what you're trying to do here. But it also kind of bleeds into it. So I think you're thinking about this where I'd ask people to give me a summary of what was going on right here. But again, this seems to be almost more of an argument of like he wants a better solution than torture. However, he stands for the strong original opinion that torture is least destructive and life-changing for the amount of people, and therefore the most humane way of ending wars right here. Summary is good, but I think what I would say in terms of the organization is that I would start with the introduction talking about some kind of element of rhetoric. Maybe if your focus is on pathos or logos or something like this, you could start there and say, although he uses a lot of, although pathos can really persuade an audience, ultimately it's logic that wins the day. That might be the big generalization you start with. An example of this is Sam Harris's article in defense of torture, where he talks about, he uses pathos to persuade the audience, but ultimately his point is conveyed by logos. So that then we kind of go, big picture idea to secondary idea of Sam Harris as the example. And then you come into your thesis. And that's the other thing that seems to be missing, was that I didn't have a clear place saying that something like, well, I think that might be this right here. In Harris's argument, he hopes to both inform the reader and persuade the reader. His informative is sprinkled through the paper in not only facts but also philosophical situations. So that I think that's where you're talking about this right here. But I think you need to be clear in setting up for that. Is effective because he uses logos through the paper to persuade his audience right there. I think so, laying it out pretty clearly for your audience. But then you start here with this idea that I would, again, so the language of saying like pathos would be good. He's trying to, these highly, not improbable, that's not the things what you're saying, but you just use the same thing, is that they're very much used to, elicit an emotion. So this idea of torturing people who've kidnapped the reader's daughter, is bad, and the daughter's already been kidnapped. So that these are trying to elicit an emotion as well. And again, this high, when you're saying here is like he's yelling at the reader right here. So that if that's true, which I think there might be an argument for that, then you need to provide, well, what causes that? You make at least 3 points in the text that you can say. And is it the language? Is it how he words it? What does it? What gives him the sense of high moral ground? And you might look to, there's definitely this thing where, I don't know, I think the Levine essay, he really is yelling at us right here. I don't know if Harris is yelling at us. He's giving us very difficult situations that we have to work through, but I think the tone is, a little softer. So I think you need to think about that as well. So I think you need to think about an introduction that kind of puts us into a context, that talks about rhetoric, then moves to Harris as an example, give us a clear thesis. I think maybe using the language of ethos, pathos, and logos would also help to kind of clarify what you're talking about as well. I think there are a couple places where you need to be more specific in how these things work as well. All right, I hope this was helpful.